So when you get into the details of the planning agenda, essentially what you're doing is doing a blow-by-blow description of how you're going to facilitate each activity. And this is an example of that. In the overall time frame, how long do you think this activity is going to take? You have some estimates in your teaching plan, but depending on how you handle it, it could take longer, and you can make some decisions. Where do you want to spend the most time? So this is an example of the kind of detail that we're looking at. And really the thinking behind this is if you don't plan ahead, that those learner engagement activities aren't going to go very well. All right. And so the more you think through the real specifics, how are you going to divide the class into groups if you want to do that? What are some quick ways to do that? Some of you posted the M&M idea. Okay, that's a great idea. One of the gals that worked in the training sessions with us did that. It was hugely popular, as you can imagine. And it was quick and efficient, and it was an easy way to get people into groups. How are you going to handle the materials? In this case, it's a case study situation. The idea is that they're going to be in groups so they can work on this together. You're going to give the groups 15 minutes. Each group is going to reporting out is another one, depending on how many people you have. How can you do that without taking all day? They're going to summarize the key points. So you have thought through very clearly exactly how you're going to do each activity. That's the idea of the planning agenda. Typically, one of the biggest struggles that you're dealing with or need to be prepared for in case your timeline changes is you're running out of time or you don't have as much time as you would like. So some strategies to keep in mind about that is that as nice as it can be to work in smaller groups, doing a whole group activity is usually quicker because you don't have to divide them into groups. You can select a couple people to report out rather than everybody if you had some kind of activity. Do a simple brainstorm rather than something with Post-its or small groups or Padlet boards. Divide the activity among groups rather than all groups doing the whole thing. Some activities can lend themselves to that. So that's some of the strategies that you can do. So in order to plan for engagement, the basic process is that you're reviewing your teaching plan. You're reviewing the information in the land access trainer manual that has all of the, all those ideas that you can look at to see if there's anything that would help you with your planning. And then you use the planning agenda worksheet to detail how you're going to incorporate engagement strategies in your lesson delivery. So this is an example of the teaching plan. We've looked at those several times already. This is what the planning agenda starts to look like. You're thinking about a particular context. You're reviewing the things in the training manual in terms of strategies that you might want to adapt or use, and then thinking through what's going to work best for you and your particular situation. So we're going to do another activity where you're going to have, in this case, 15 minutes of work time. And what I'm going to ask you to do is we're all going to focus on Learning Plan 1. So you don't have to dig into the other areas. So you've got the Learning Plan 1 teaching plan, the planning agenda or the sample planning agenda as an example, which actually is Learning Plan 1 too. So you have a lot of things to look at, but I want you to think about how you would customize it for your situation. Then there's the planning agenda worksheet, which you can use. You either can print it out and just write on it, or you can do it in the electronic version on your computer, and then the training manual to refer to. So I want you to think about a context that you might be actually doing a training where you would use this introduction to land tenure lesson, either on its own or as part of a bigger session. I'll bring up the planning agenda in a second and kind of highlight the sections that I want you to do. But think about the context. What do you think this would be? What kind of a context? Who do you think the participants will be? And then I want you to focus primarily on the motivation activity. Think about how you would process it. Think about the different examples that you saw and really picture it in your mind and add your step-by-step steps for how you would facilitate that activity. I'd like you to do it differently than how it is in the sample planning agenda. So give some thought to how you might customize it. And then you can look at the comprehension phase if you have time in that 15 minutes. And begin to think about particularly how you might need to adapt the content. You can look at the storyboard for that lesson and start to see what kind of content is included in that storyboard, and see if you can think of some ways that you might need to modify that for your training session. So you've got 15 minutes. You're going to get the teaching plan out of Podio if you don't already have that. The sample planning agenda, so you can look at that, the planning agenda worksheet, and your land access trainer manual. We're going to give you 15 minutes. So let me show you what the planning agenda worksheet looks like. It looks like this. So, obviously you don't know the dates and times probably, but maybe you do. Your context, your class size, your participants, the facility. Think about what your facility is going to be like. If you've, trained at this place before, what's it like? What kind of facilities do you have? And then focus primarily on your motivation, activity, and comprehension. What I'd like to do, and I'll kind of open it to somebody to volunteer to start, but if you don't, I'm going to call on people. So what I'd like you to do is tell us a little bit about what you're thinking in terms of how you envision the context of what your training situation would be. Maybe the next time, or when you have an opportunity to deliver this introduction to land tenure. What's this context? Who are your people going to be? What's your facility going to be like? And then talk us through a little bit how you adapted the activities. What are you seeing as things that you would want to make sure to do, and how you would handle that motivation activity, okay, in particular, and then also the comprehension one. So is there anybody who'd like to start by sharing what they came up with? Any brave?
I can start.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome. So I'm in a unique position where I have long-term relationships with a lot of farmers in the area based off of their need for conservation planning and financial assistance. So I envisioned that this training would mostly be farmers that I know, or that know a fellow conservation planner in the NRCS office, which does help the situation quite a bit, having that established relationship. Something that I struggled with this planning agenda worksheet was thinking in a dual brain, virtually versus the dreamland of being able to have an in-person training session again. So I thought about it both ways, but if this was a virtual or an in-person training, that established relationship is really helpful. One of the modifications that I made to the motivation activity was to kind of make it a fill in the blank. That way you can steer the conversation to the points that may differ, that are going to be different for different farmers or different people seeking land access. Mm-hmm. And you can highlight the things that you're going to be able to assist with down the road. So I thought that might be a good way to adjust that. And I also thought that that particular motivation activity of discussing where they see themselves in 5 to 10 years could easily be combined with the introduction activity if you were short on time.
Yep, good point. Yep.
That's as far as I got.
Okay, good. Any sense of, in terms of the content, I know you didn't have a lot of time to look at it, but is there any thoughts that you have as far as your particular situation where when you get to that storyboard, there's kind of local information you might want to, any thoughts on that, or didn't really get that far?
I didn't get quite that far, but I do think that that there's going to be a lot of similarities, and there's going to be a few things that a lot of people are hung up on in terms of their land access. It's going to be the same roadblock for a lot of people, particularly in New England. It's the cost of land. So I envision that that's going to be one of the major things that comes up over and over again, for sure.
Yeah. Well, and you know, the intro one, not so much, but as you get into some of the more advanced training sessions from what we've seen with other trainers, there's a lot more need to really think, you know, when you're talking about buying land cost, you know, pricing and stuff like that. So some of the later sessions it's really important to think about how you pull in regional data and things like that. So maybe not as much with this one, but it's definitely something in your planning agenda and in your thinking you want to be thinking about. And good point about the combo with the introduction. You can often do that. We kept them separate to make the point that, you know, do the intro stuff too, you know, introduce the lesson and stuff like that. But a lot of times you can combine those two. So that's a good thought. Who wants to go next?
I can go next.
Okay, thank you, Billy.
So I kind of thought about this in a more hypothetical sense, just because I recently joined on, so I don't have a lot of experience yet engaging with some of the farmers in my local area. But when I used to live in New York, I found like an introduction to beekeeping, like sort of discussion group through Facebook. So I kind of like used that as my inspiration. And this is like outside of the COVID world, hypothetical world. So I was thinking it would be kind of like this ongoing meeting group that would happen in like a public library, like library meeting room or something. And I pretty much like stuck to the workshop agenda that was in the teacher lesson training plan. But one of the things that I added to the comprehension activity was instead of just jumping right into the presentation, I had kind of open up with, has anybody like dipped their toes into trying to get, you know, work through some land access issues, and what are those challenges that they came across? So then as you're working through the presentation, you can kind of stop and highlight, because you know some people in your audience are kind of have already worked through that or are trying to work through that, and that's the information that they're going to want to hear. But yeah, that was kind of the big thing that I changed from. Yeah.
And that is a very good idea and a good strategy, because the other purpose of the motivation activity, or like Billy said, something that you incorporate in the comprehension part, is you want to get a sense of what they already know, you know, or what they don't already know, or what they care about. And so as much as in any way that, because then you can build off it, just like she said, you know, if somebody brings up an idea and you can build on that, and it helps make that whole content piece more interesting to the participants, because they're hearing it from other people. So that's a really good idea too, as you're thinking about these activities. Well, the last thing that we wanted to talk about then was just in terms of where you're going to go from here. You know, what are your next steps? Based on what you learned today, you have access to the materials, you have access to some strategies and planning tools. So what do you see as your next steps to be ready to use the curriculum in training situations? Sarah?
There's certainly a lot of content here to get familiar with. And I think we all agreed earlier in our little sticky note session that being familiar with the material is really helpful. So I think that's definitely a next step. And then in the Northeast, gauging need for this kind of training. I'm sure it's been done, and we're lucky here to have a lot of people on the ground face to face with farmers to see who still needs the training and if another session is required.
How about you, Billy? What are your next steps?
Just kind of echoing what Sarah said, we are in the same position in different places. So I definitely think that the content is something that I really need to familiarize myself with before I can even utter a word of this to somebody else. But I don't know how soon, just because of, you know, COVID and all that stuff, these kinds of trainings will end up happening. Perhaps this kind of material is something that will be introduced on a more one-on-one basis with existing farmers. But I definitely think beyond the land access training, this like curriculum outline could be applied to many different things. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
but yeah, for short term, I think definitely just reading up on the content and seeing where it's appropriate to kind of weave that in.
Yeah, I would really recommend that is becoming familiar with, because there's so much in there. And then you can start to think, to what extent do you maybe want to consolidate a couple? There's a lot of the trainers that we've worked with over the last couple of years. That's kind of how they see it, like a couple pieces that could sort of go together. So it's what, the more familiar you are with everything that's there, the more you'll be able to think about how that might work too. So. Well, great. Thanks a lot, everybody. And I hope that this was valuable to you.